Okay, so he got his foot in on this first documentary that mainly involved me, Scientologists at War, which came out in 2013. Tony Ortega, okay? Which, when I watched it, I said, he ruined the whole thing, because what he did was, the way they used him was they would intersperse him. Like, they would show interviews with me on a subject, and then occasionally they'd have him come in to interpret what I was saying, and therefore come to conclusions that they wouldn't get me to come to. And that's how he was used through that. So he was taking a story and turning it into, taking what I was saying and turning it into something that it wasn't, is what they were pretty skillfully doing. And that was their technique, okay? So then Going Clear comes along. And, what blows me away is Alex Gibney gets all these accolades. I mean, it's just this sort of cult of celebrity culture we live in. It's like, once you are recognized by somebody, you're somebody to be lionized. I mean, I was blown away that he used the exact, wasn't original in the slightest. He did the exact same thing in Going Clear that those fellas had done in the other movie. And those guys, by the way, were novice filmmakers. Okay? The guys from the UK, they worked for a guy who was a producer who had won Oscars, okay? But this was part of a program where he was taking promising young directors and saying, here's all this stuff, go make a documentary. So Gibney actually ripped off from these cinematography students this technique and just basically used the same thing. He had Ortega. See, if you get the book Going Clear and go to the index and look for Tony Ortega, and he's not there. 0 pages. He's not even in it. Okay. Now we're going to go to the movie, which is, according to Gibney, a recreation of the book. He's suddenly the critical link to everything. And the reason why I say he's the critical link to everybody, it's not that he has more airtime, but it's more critical, crucial airtime, because Gibney uses Ortega in exactly the same way that the folks did in Scientologists at War. And that is, he bridges. He'll be telling this he'll be putting together this salacious episode segment, right? And it just doesn't quite add up. And then all of a sudden there's Tony Ortega with a convenient sound bite that sort of leads you to this conclusion. And it's interspersed throughout it. And, and I wrote to him, I think I wrote to him, I told him, I may have wrote to him, I may be in writing, but I told Alex Gibney, in posterity, that was the dumbest thing you ever did. This guy is a troll. He's a avowed anti-Scientologist. He has no personal experience, and you putting him into this movie, cheapens it and turns it into a propaganda piece, and it does. He has no personal experience. I mean, this guy, or if you want to talk about Ortega, so Ortega does a book. So Ortega gets a deal with the Village Voice because the Village Voice, and ultimately the CEO and one of the directors got indicted and arrested for running prostitution, human trafficking of minors. That's their main source of income for the Village Voice publication. And so they got to get rid of Ortega because, according to Ortega, I quote Ortega, Ortega said, because it turns out that the church's accusations and investigations into the Voice were more true than anybody believed. Okay? Essentially, the Village Voice was bought and paid for through the human trafficking back page ads. And so what they did as a solution was They wanted to get out of the scrutiny of the church because, of course, Tony Ortega was doing nothing to the Village Voice, but sort of becoming what he later became, a full-time anti-Scientologist. And so he wasn't helping general circulation with his editing work, right? He was harming it, and all he was doing was bringing the scrutiny of the church upon them. So what they decided to do was give him a sweet honey package that he could go off and do what he wanted to do, which was to write a book about Scientology. And it was a pretty sweet package because he lived for 2 years and got to go shop it, do nothing else but, and then go shop it, right? So he gets his package. So what does he do? He goes and gets this woman who settled with the church 35 years ago, right? And gets her to unsettle, Paulette Cooper. Okay? Because she's got this story of going after the church and the church going after her. That's, a very salacious story, which was told in the 70s, right? And then she had a subsequent litigation, and she settled in 1981. 35 years later, he's going to resurrect her, right? And so, in the hopes that maybe he can become her. Yeah, I think the guy is just, unbelievably disappointed that Scientology didn't take the bait and come after him, I mean, he'd been trolling so hard. I mean, here's this guy, and he talks with all this authority, and he's done all this, and this, and all he can talk about in terms of harassment is what happened to the woman who he wrote a book about that happened 40 years ago. Not to him, but the woman he wrote a book about. You know what I'm saying? So and this is this whole culture. It's this whole ASC culture of your narrative's my narrative. We're all one big narrative and one just big cluster. And you suffered that, and therefore I suffered that, and therefore everybody should be in fear of suffering that. It's just this insanity. And that's Tony Ortega.